Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and my hair is terrible today. We've sort of reached that stage in quarantine again where, like, my hair is really bad, but coronavirus numbers are up high enough that I'm not willing to go to a barbershop. So it's just going to get worse and worse until eventually I cave and cut it myself, and that will also be a bad thing. But we're not here to talk about my hair. This is a video that I've been wanting to do for a while. I'm really excited about this. I wanted to talk to you guys today about 3 of my favorite witchcraft novels. Fiction is fun, and who among us does not like reading books about witches, right? I grew up with Harry Potter. Harry Potter was a formative part of my childhood, and even though I'm not really as into it as much as an adult, I'd be lying if I said Harry Potter wasn't in some way an influence on my decision to get into witchcraft as an adult. That said, fuck J.K. Rowling. I'm not here for the transphobia. But, once again, not what this video is about. So I have 3 of my favorite witchcraft novels that I just wanted to talk through a little bit with you. At least 2 of these, probably all 3, are books that you might not have heard of, and I just really love them and wanted to share. So, going into this, just a couple of thoughts about genre. There are a lot of books that are much beloved in the witchcraft community that do not appear on this list. And sometimes that's because I just haven't read them. So I've never actually read Practical Magic, right? That's, a gap in my literary education, but as such, because this is a list of my personal favorite witch books, I can't put Practical Magic on there because I haven't read it. Likewise, there are some sort of works of high fantasy that people really love, that I also really love, that don't make their way onto this list, largely because I'm focusing not so much on novels about magic as specifically novels about witchcraft in sort of an old school classical sense. So the witches in the novels that I'm going to bring up today are sort of diabolical witches, right? These are all novels about witches sort of in the sense of people who have a pact with Satan that gives them magical powers and that sort of thing. So very sort of like old school Margaret Murray, like witchcraft in the woods type of thing, which means that works of high fantasy like the Lord of the Rings books, like Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea Quartet, both of which have been very influential on me and I love them, don't really count as witch novels in my mind, and so I'm excluding them from the list. Same thing actually with the Harry Potter books. Even though, the Harry Potter series talks about witchcraft and wizardry, it's magic in a very different sort of fantasy sense, rather than, like, dancing naked in the woods type witchcraft, which is the sort of thing that I'm more interested in when it comes to looking for witch novels, right? I want things that are, in some sense, a little bit closer to the kind of witchcraft I practice. I love those other books, but I'm not including them on this list, just sort of as a matter of categorization. Likewise, for The Sea Priestess by Dion Fortune, that's not on this list. It's a wonderful book. It's a fantastic occult novel. It's not about witchcraft. It's a different thing, even though in some ways it's very, very similar to a lot of what we do in my tradition of witchcraft. It's just, like, it's not a witch book in my mind, so not on the list. I think, and the one other book I want to mention that I am not putting on the list, for kind of all of the reasons listed above, is The Mists of Avalon. I've never read it, but I'm given to understand it's a work of high fantasy. It's this Arthurian mythos. Not a witchcraft book in my mind. And also, Marion Zimmer Bradley, who would have thought that the author who is most famous for writing about incest would have some horrible history of sexual abuse? So anyways, with that all put aside, let's dive into books. The first book that I want to talk about is called The Lancashire Witches by William Harrison Ainsworth. Ainsworth is a contemporary of Charles Dickens. At his time, oh, I have a feather in here, that's exciting. At his time, he was considered an equal to Charles Dickens. And this book is a Victorian romance extraordinaire, which means a couple of things. For one thing, William Harrison Ainsworth was paid by the word, and he writes like it. So reading this, you sort of have to be willing to wade through some very wordy writing, because that's just the style of the time, and that's also, this man was trying to get paid. But also, as Victorian romance, this is a book where all of the good characters are just larger-than-life good, and they're beautiful, and they usually come from the nobility. And all of the bad characters are ugly and nasty, and they're peasants. And there is no such thing as subtlety anywhere in this book. This is a very, it's a soap opera. And, there's a big reveal about a quarter of the way through the book that one of the characters was actually born into the nobility. She was born to a noble family, and then the peasant witches kidnapped her and raised her as their own. And anyone could have seen this coming, because she's the only member of the peasant witch family who is beautiful and kind-hearted. So, not a subtle book, but it's fun just for how ridiculous and over-the-top it is. And the book itself is a novelization of the trials of the Pendle witches in Lancashire in the early 1600s. So it's based on a historical account, a series of actual witch trials that did take place. But it sort of ramps up the romance and the fantasy. There's all kinds of love and intrigue and children who were kidnapped and, all sorts of just torrid romance to it. And then on top of that, it plays up the magic angle. So there are, literal demons who appear and demon familiars and works of magic and all sorts of things. It's just a fun book. You have to be willing to read for the genre that it is, right? You have to be in the mood to read sort of a Dickensian, overblown romance. But it's the sort of thing where, if you like Great Expectations, and you want to read a witch novel, you'll probably enjoy The Lancashire Witches. So that's book number 1. Book number 2 is Witchwood by John Buchan. So Buchan is a Scottish author. This is the only book of his that I've read, but he also sort of more famously wrote the novel The 39 Steps, upon which the Alfred Hitchcock movie is based. And this is a fictional account of a Scottish Presbyterian minister who arrives at a small town in Scotland in the 1640s and discovers that there is a coven of witches among his sort of pious, law-abiding parishioners. And the whole thing is set against the backdrop of Scotland's role in the English Civil War. So this takes place in the mid-1640s. Which I did, this is a historical education, this is a thing I don't know a lot about. I didn't know much about the English Civil War or Scotland's role in it prior to reading this book, so I sort of had to periodically, go away and, open up the Wikipedia page for, the Scottish Covenanters, or, the Marquis de Montrose, and so there's an actual historical figure, the Marquis de Montrose, who is a character in this book. But sort of aside from that, it's this really sort of intriguing, fast-paced story about, sort of discovering hypocrisy and, Satanism at the heart of the Scottish Church. It reads very much like The Wicker Man. It has a very similar vibe of, the pious Christian arriving and discovering that he's surrounded by a pagan cult, and there's this conspiracy against him, and he doesn't quite know where it's going, and it's intense and suspenseful, and I read the whole thing in 2 days. I just sat down and devoured this book. It also has a surprising amount of 17th century church politics to it, which might not be everyone's jam, but like there are these moments of really high tension where his superiors in the church are like, "Is it true that you said that faith alone is not sufficient for salvation?" And which is just exciting. A lot of people probably would not consider that exciting, but it plays into the driving force of the plot. And there are some really interesting themes about like things that were wrong with the internal politics of the Scottish Presbyterian Kirk, um, and the way that sort of the hypocrisy of the sort of outwardly pious Satanists in the parish plays into that dynamic. So I just really enjoyed this book. And you know, it's fun and different. This is not a work of fantasy, as opposed to the Lancashire Witches, where there are actual like demons and shit showing up. This is very much a matter of like there are people wearing masks, dancing naked in the woods, and performing satanic rites, and they're evil and malicious, and there's a conspiracy, but it's there's no sort of supernatural magic to it. That said, there are a couple of descriptions of witch sabbats. There's a Beltane Sabbat that the minister witnesses. There's a Lammas Sabbat, and it's just really interesting. You can tell like Buchan read Margaret Murray for sure. So definitely just a different book, a witch novel that I think most people haven't heard of, and yeah, once again, very very Wicker Man vibes. The ending is not as good as the Wicker Man, but the overall sort of pace of the story and the feeling of sort of panic and paranoia, very, very similar. So, fun book. And my last of these three recommendations is different. This one doesn't take place in England. It's not based on a historical account. Well, this isn't based on a historical account, but it takes place sort of at a period in history, and it features actual sort of historical figures from the Scottish Civil War. English Civil War, excuse me. My last one is The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov, which is just wonderful. This is my favorite witch novel, and it's different. It's I didn't appreciate it as much the first time I read it. This was written in the 1920s. It's largely a satire of Soviet culture, so it takes place in Moscow. And in particular, it's a satire of Soviet atheism. So the basic premise of this book is in Moscow in the 1920s, the devil arrives. And in sort of the city that is the capital of atheism in the world, the devil shows up and starts fucking with people. And he has, a couple of demons who are his servants who, just screw people over in delightful, hilarious ways that are, once again, largely subverting and satirizing Soviet bureaucracy. And then the whole thing culminates in, there's a great sort of grand Sabbat that the devil hosts. And he has to find a woman to be the witch queen for his grand Sabbat. And then there's a whole romantic plot with her and her husband and her lover. And, everyone gets together happily at the end. And there's a lot of thematic depth to this book. So in particular, let's see if I can find it. The book opens with a quote from Goethe. Yeah. So the very beginning of the quote, you have, I am part of the power which forever wills evil and forever works good. And that's from Faust. And the picture of the devil that we get in this book is of sort of a left hand of God. Of the Christian God, right? So the devil, is evil, is sort of out to work mischief and harm, but ultimately the presence of the devil in the universe brings about the best for everyone. And the Margarita, the witch queen, and her lover end up happy together, and everyone learns valuable lessons, and the right people get humiliated, and so on. It's there's a very complicated picture of the devil, his relation to God, his role in the world. And throughout the story, there's sort of interwoven this secondary story, which tells the story of Christ and Pontius Pilate, and sort of novelizes them meeting, and the sort of pardoning of Barabbas, the murderer, and Pilate sort of trying to absolve himself of sin for killing Christ and being confused by Christ, and sort of the big moral questions that Pontius Pilate deals with. Pontius Pilate is one of the most important characters in this book, even though he's not part of the main storyline. And the themes we see with the relationship between Pilate and Christ then reflect back on the main events that are happening in Moscow. So it's a really rich, sort of complex book. I didn't fully digest it until the second time I read it, but it's one of my favorite books, and it's just wonderful. This is another one where Wikipedia might be helpful, because there's a lot of context here of sort of inside jokes and references to Soviet culture and things that if you're not familiar with the workings of the Soviet Union, you'll be a little bit lost as to like why there are 7 different families living in one apartment together or things like that. But it's such a wonderful book. It really, really is. And it wasn't published until after Bulgakov's death, because it was so sharply critical of the Soviet regime that he could not safely publish it. But yeah, so these are my 3 witchcraft novels. I wanted to pick ones that are not as widely known, that are potentially not as popular, but they're just all 3 of them are fun, and I really enjoyed reading all 3. Yeah, I don't know, like witch literature, it's a thing, right? It's a thing we all seek out. We all watch bad witchcraft TV, and we all watch witch movies, and have our favorite witch movies. And witch novels are sort of a whole other area of that I think we don't talk about as much. We talk about witch movies, right? We all have our favorites. We have ranging from like The Witch to the fucking Wizard of Oz. We all have movies that we love that feature witches and witchcraft, and that we can watch over and over and over again. And I wanted to just spend some time thinking about the novels that are like that sort of give us our witchcraft fix. So, yeah, let me know which books you love, if there are ones that I've left off this list. I'm always looking for further recommendations. And yeah, other than that, I will be back at some point. That's all I got. Bye, everyone.